in the late 50s in Oklahoma with the NAACP Youth Councils, who organized some of the first student sit-ins and demonstrations. Or it started in North Carolina in the early 1960s with, again, people who were in NAACP Youth Council, but they had also become the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. There are problems, in my view, with research. Much research does not have integrity. Deliberately distorts and confuses issues and whatnot because they are pushing a certain agenda. They're not looking for truth. They just have an agenda, a position they want to run, and in many instances, they're fighting to get paid. But we started in 1969. I had been the acting Midwest director of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee since the high school rebellion in Forestville High School. And 12 students in Forestville, 6 or 7 of whom were gangster disciples. SNCC had been organizing the gangster disciples since 1966. Truthfully, the first Black Panther Party in Chicago was in '66 with Yari Amir, not with Fred Hampton and Bob Rush in '68, '69. But we won't get off into that. There were all kinds of student rebellions. In '63, the high school students went to the streets. By 4 years later, by 1967, the high school student activists had become college student activists. Even I went to college for about 6 months in 1966 at Luke Junior College, which has been renamed Harold Washington College. But anyway, we were in the student movement all over the world. You had Mark Shinnis and a whole generation of youth in Zania and South Africa who were the high school students of PAC. And they are the ones who were doing the rebellions and the demonstrations. Mark, for example, spent 10 years in Robben Island 2 separate times. Once from '63 to around '76, '77, he was thrown back in Robben Island for another 10 years, accused of helping organize the Soweto Rebellion. Well, we had a similar phenomenon in Chicago. People like me who were 15 in 1963 when we joined the movement, by the time we were 18 and 19, we were either on the college campus or at least we were organizing college students. We had Jim Turner, who was at Northwestern University for members only. And when he graduated, he became the head of the African American or Africana Studies Department at Cornell. You had John Bracey, who was at Roosevelt University, and he wound up at Amherst. I mean, we could just go on. You had Wayne Watson, who wound up at Shaw University and wound up becoming, superintendent of Chicago school system for a different point in time. Well, I wasn't a student technically, and I have problems with the professors, but long story short, Cy Williams and Andy Thompson and Harold Pace and, Bob Starks and Conrad Worrell, they went from Chicago to Atlanta for a teachers conference. They had what they call the Parent-Teacher-Student Alliance. And of course, because of their age's perspective, they figured they were taught us and they figured they were controlling us. I never had a black college professor or black teacher, not even a high school teacher, until I was 24 at Shaw University and whatnot, because we went to integrated Morgan Park. It was desegregated in the 1930s by Frank Sinatra. There's a history. But anyway, there was an African Studies meeting in 1967 in Los Angeles. And Leonard Jeffries and other forces helped organize the walkout and the boycott there. And then there was another in 69, I believe it was at UDC, and 68. And they wound up at Montreal in 69. And the Black Caucus of the African Studies Association walked out, and they founded something called the African Heritage Studies Association. That had some key people. Jim Turner, the initial Central Committee was Jim Turner and John Bracey and Leonard Jeffries. I knew Bracey and I knew Turner. I knew of Leonard Jeffries, but never had any relationship with him. Wasn't because, one, he had problems with Kwame Nkrumah, he had problems with Kwame Ture, and he had problems with the New York forces, didn't like the Chicago forces, and back and forth. So wasn't on me getting caught up in that. But I met the Igbo contingent. There were a group of so-called Igbo Nigerians from Igbo land, from Owerri, Nigeria. And there was a link. You had Nicholas D.U. Onyewu and P. Chiki Onwachi, who were two of Leo Hansberry's last research assistants. And you had Fayon Goldman and other forces who were down at Shaw University. Kwame became very close to Chiki. I was very close to Nick. He called himself my godfather. And we knew Fayon, especially when I got down to Shaw, because the mother of my two daughters, Doris Green, she was one of Fayon's students at Shaw University and whatnot. So anyway, this group of people, maybe 3 to 6, they were in charge of African studies, mainly with the Nigerian contingent across North America. At that point in time, there was a civil war, the Biafra Civil War. And every time they would lose 2 or 3 times, they would change the capital of the city. So at one point, Owerri became the capital. And Nick's daddy was the chief of the tribe. And rumor has, or history has, that it is Nick who started the not Nick, Nick's father, who started the Nigeria's Civil War, and it is Nick's father who ordered Adbanjo, not Adbanjo, that he was, anyway, the head of the Nigerian Igbo army. I almost called his name. So long story short, they lost and they had to settle the war. And Nicholas D. Onyewu organized something called the Owerri Rural Development Fund, and appointed me secretary. On paper, I was young and dumb and really knew very little about the Igbo Civil War, and all the different forces and whatnot. But Nick came to me one time and asked me if I could introduce him to some millionaires. black millionaires. I told him no. When we had no access to them like that. But I told him that I would introduce him to Archie Hargraves and C.T. Vivian. So I took him to Archie's house, you know, while they were eating breakfast, I was cooking the meal and whatnot. And long story short, they had their conversation. And Nick says to Archie, you know, what can I do for you? And Archie said, well, he's achieved everything he wanted to do in his life except one thing. He wanted to be a college president. So Nick asked him, do you know Shaw University? And Archie told him his story about when he was the godson of the president of A&T, and his mama knew all the North Carolina people up in the Harlem Renaissance and whatnot. And Archie said, I'd like to be a president. So Nick told him, you will. And Nick borrowed the telephone and he called, I think it was Reverend Jones of the Baptist Convention down in North Carolina, and said, I want you to appoint Archie president of Shaw University. Reverend Jones said, no problem. So when they hung up, Nick came to me and said, Bob, do you have access to the students at Shaw? I said, no, I don't. But Cleveland Sellers does. So I called Cleveland Sellers and said, do we have any contacts with students? And he said, yeah, Gerald Leak. We called him Big Kweku, because he's a big brother. John Mendez was the student government president before this. It's 6 months, 3 months earlier. Big Kweku had become the student government president then. So I asked him, can you invite Archie down to Shaw to speak to the students and have the students and whatnot? And can you have the students endorse him for president? And Kweku said, yes, he got the job. Wasn't no discussion, he got the job. And whatnot. So within a week, Archie was down at Shaw University, and Archie became president of Shaw University. And it's a long history, again, depending on who you speak to. But long story short, Nick was one of the Africans on the Central Committee, whatever the title was, of the African Studies Association. And Nick and I, became very close. I had to have permission from the judge to travel. And in order to get permission, I had to get somebody to invite me, do a speaking engagement, whatever. And Nick and his wife were traveling every now and then, and they needed a babysitter for his son, who wound up becoming one of the top Nigerian athletes who lived in the D.C. metropolitan area. So I flew back and forth. And that through Nick, I got a better hands-on understanding of some of the issue of African studies. But this protest, this boycott with the African Student Association, that I said wound up creating the African version, African Heritage Studies Association, because there was a split between Afro-American studies and African studies. So that gave me an introduction to some of the key professors in the late 60s. Archie went to Shaw in 71. So that is, an introduction. 30 years later, the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, Tanzania. They call it South African. And Conrad Wardwell and Wilder Plummer, with the ALSC madness, they organized something. They organized a contingent of 400 Africans from the United States to attend the World Conference of Africa. And of course, they invited me to attend, and I said no. And the reason being, I took Conrad to Geneva, Switzerland. But in order to get into the UN, you have to have an invitation. I had already been deported from Geneva, accused of helping plan to kill out of the North, which was not true. Not true. It's a long story. But in order to get back into Geneva, I got a letter signed by Bill Means and Andrea Carmen, appointing me as an NGO ambassador representing the International Indian Treaty Council at the UN. They refused to give Conrad one because he wanted Indian land in the United States. So he got his credentials, his letter of invitation through Viola and Roger Wareham. And at that point in time, they were New Africans. I had no intentions of traveling nowhere under the guise of a New African. I'm an African, but I did travel as an honorary Indian. So it is through the World Conference Against Racism that I really had a formal introduction to this project. We were working on a book, and let me just read some stats. They had 2,300 representatives from 163 countries, including 16 heads of state, 58 foreign ministers, 44 ministers, 4,000 representatives of non-governmental organizations, and 1,100 media representatives. But I did not go to the governmental session, even though Mary Makeba was one of the ANC delegation, and I could have easily gotten unlimited access to that conference through Makeba. Because even though she and Kwame had broken up by then, I was still very close and very friendly with her. But I did not want to go to the United Nations because it was many of those presidents were as corrupt and filthy then as they are now. Look at the Nigerian president, the way he disrespected Ibrahim Traore. Look at how they attempted recently just to kill him again. So I didn't want to be bothered with that neo-colonialism. But they also had an NGO forum from 28 August to 1 September 2001. And they had 8,000 representatives from 3,000 NGOs. African Roots and I were empowered and able to participate in this NGO forum by a host of people. And let me read a few names. A-APRP, some of the forces that we were still friendly with and working with, they helped empower me to go. A-APRP-GC did not exist at that moment in history. We had Lester Lewis of the Hackney Black People's Association of London. We had Dr. Masoko Peku and the Pan-Africanist Congress of Zania. And one of the reasons I did not go to the governmental session because ANC refused to allow any of the opposition parties to attend WACA. There was no way in hell if PAC could not attend the conference, I would attend. especially because at that point in time I had the honor and privilege to serve as the national president of PAC's election campaign for presidency, and we won 3 parliamentary seats. And then I came back a couple of years later and was the head of PAC's election campaign for local governments, and we won 17 local government seats with no money. No money. All we had was raggedy little leaflets. The PAC chapters would elect their candidate in different precincts and cities and whatnot, at their meeting. And when we go home that night, I would stay at the PAC headquarters because I had access to the computer and I could make international contact. So when they would elect a candidate, I would send the fax. So email was just starting. And in that time period, 2001, I would beg donations, to PAC elected the candidate, but they had no money. So we needed money to register their candidacy. We needed money to print their first 50 or 100 leaflets to launch their campaign. And I would identify different cities and different individuals in the A-APRP and in other organizations to adopt the candidate. The governmental session passed a resolution, the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. And they acknowledged paragraph 13, it's a 300-page declaration and program, but paragraph 13 acknowledged that slavery and the slave trade are crimes against humanity and should have always been so, especially the transatlantic slave trade. I disagreed with that acknowledgement. Should have always been so. And I have been fighting since 2001 against those 5 words. Should have always been so. That is why the slogan was underlined historically and is today illegal and a crime against humanity. And we took the position 24 years ago with no resources, little resources that we had, to help change this master narrative. Should have always been so became the master narrative, the educational historical narrative, the legal narrative for the reparations movement. Because basically they said then and have maintained that if slavery and the slave trade was legal, you had nothing coming. You couldn't get standing in court, you couldn't get nothing. But if it's legal, then they don't owe you nothing. So while I don't necessarily, I'm not fighting for reparations, I'm fighting to change the narrative. And change gonna come, even though not in my lifetime. I'm at the end of that, but it's gonna come. And unfortunately, if the reparations movement was a little different and a little better, they would see how what I'm trying to do would help them, especially if we succeed. They ain't got to be dogmatic on, I got to fight for reparations if I'm helping them. So I maintain that position. I don't want reparations. I want reparations for everybody who has wronged. I want reparations for 53,000 Palestinians who are being killed, because any person who is sick needs to be healed if possible. Any person who has been wronged or injured needs to be repaired. There can be no true repair without repatriation. And all aspects of repair and healing are not necessarily connected to a dollar bill. So at least since 69 and 271 when I went to Shaw, and 2001 at Wake in Durban, I have been fighting. I've been fighting with two slogans. Slavery and the slave trade were and are crimes against humanity. Release the files. Full disclosure of all slavery era and colonial records. And the slogan that God makes no slaves in the womb. So I continue that effort today. That is basically how we formally talk about how it started. And we're still part of it. So we've been doing something, however small, however little, however small, since 2001. And there have been more forces fighting us. I mean, you can't imagine the forces who are fighting us, or the forces who are trying to buy me. I mean, I don't have nothing. I'm semi-homeless. When I got off the phone earlier today, we had a quick meeting, knocked on the door, and my landlord told me, Bob, I may have helped you find a place. I'll take you to the senior citizen because you got to move. I'm evicted. I got some reprieve because there was a major leak in the building. And one reason why I don't want no company and I don't want no Zoom broadcast is because of the condition under which I'm living and whatnot. But leave that aside, even while I'm packing and while I'm, dipping water with buckets and whatnot, we're still trying to do the research. We have given dozens of presentations all over the world. We have spoken at the Houses of Parliament in London. We've spoken at Erasmus University in The Hague and Amsterdam. While even though we met with one of the top heads of the Jesuit church at the Las Casas, church down in Colombia. I mean, I can just go on and on different presentations that we have given. And even though the presentations themselves may have been ragtag, because we didn't have resources, we didn't have that, we didn't have the other, the forces who invited us, the forces who were in the room were extremely impressive. We have done dozens of open letters to heads of states and popes and, dignitaries in Presbyterian churches and whatnot. So this is a continuation, one, of that project, and two, of our efforts to write some kind of a paper, some kind of a document, some kind of a book that will hopefully help prove that slavery and the slave trade, and not just the transatlantic slave trade, not just the reparations movement made several mistakes. They get mad with me when I say it, but they talk about transatlantic slave trade, but don't talk about the Trans-Sahara and the Trans-Indian Ocean and the Trans-Red Sea and the other, or the internal slavery, where priests and kings and queens of Africa have neo-colonialism 500 years ago. They don't talk about it. So my position is that slavery is slavery is slavery. A slave master, no matter what their nationality or their ethnic identities, they're no good. They're no good. So we're continuing that today. And that's part of the information that we're pulling together. So let me see a couple of things. One, we've been doing our research through WorldCat. We have identified 65,000 items that mention the word slave trade. 30,000 of them are ebooks and open source. We cannot afford that. So we've been finding creative ways to try to get documentation, get stuff for free and whatnot. Under open source, we have accessed 920 downloadable articles, 460 ebooks, 270 theses and dissertations, 150 articles, 73 chapters, and 25 print books. But we have all kinds of problems with virus, and so we lose them as much as we find them. Because since we're doing so much open source research and don't have money to properly buy virus, and because we have water pouring down on our head and soaking through some of our boxes, we lose a lot. But what we lose, we get again. Bottom line, we have identified 11 authorities which we have adopted as the base of our research. In 1788, King George III created a committee called the Lords of the Committee of Council, which is part of the British Privy Council. They did a 1-year research and testimony and whatnot in Parliament. They came up with an 890-page book, which you can get through Internet Archive. I got the 3 volumes. And they do the research on the British slave trade. And you would be amazed at how many people who got PhDs and theses quote that book. Or really, I should say, misquoted. We have another book called An Anti-Slavery Manual, or The Wrongs of American Slavery Exposed in the Light of the Bible and of Facts, with a remedy for the evil. It's a man named Reverend John C., who was one of the top educators and missionary people for the American Missionary Association. He founded all kinds of churches and all kinds of cities and all kinds of seminaries. He founded Berea College, which was the first school in the South integrated that African people should go to. And you'd be surprised at some of the distinguished people, especially women, who got their advanced degrees from Berea. The land that Berea was built on and the initial monies that built the university was donated by a man named Cassius Marcellus Clay, a white man whose family was the largest slaveholders in Kentucky. And Muhammad Ali's daddy and Muhammad Ali were named after him. That's one of the reasons that Muhammad Ali abandoned Cassius Clay, not just because of John Elijah Muhammad, not just because of Islam, because he wanted to give up that slave name and whatnot. Well, he the one who come up with the slogan, God makes no slaves in the womb. And the reason he came up with that slogan is because the Catholic countries in Central and South America had passed certain legislation and certain struggles and whatnot to, liberate African youth. They passed laws all over Latin America called free womb laws. God made no slaves in the womb. So I use that material, that book, for my open letters to the Catholic Church and to the popes. And I'm getting ready to write an open letter to Pope Leopold XIV. Now, people whom I know, they're cussing me, they're fussing me because they want me to help them struggle to make Leopold admit that he, the one-drop rule. I got time to argue that. He's already made it clear. He's a former American, born and raised, or not born, but raised in Chicago. He's abandoned Chicago and America. He became a Catholic priest or whatever in Peru, and he had Peruvian citizenship. Most recently, he declared he's Roman. He said, I am Roman. And when people want me to cuss him because he's Roman, and they get even madder with me. Do you know how many hundreds of people call themselves Greeks on HBCUs all across the country? I'm an African. I ain't confused. I'm not a new African. I'm not an Afro-descendant. I respect some of the people who say that. It speaks to their level of development, and hopefully it will go further. But if they can be Greeks, why can't he be a Roman? So that's one book. Let me just see if I can go faster. There's a man named Colonel George Washington Williams. He was a member of the colored troop, the Africans who fought on the Union side in the Civil War. And now history is reading or recording properly that Sojourner Truth and the women.
Uh, Sounds like we might be having some technical difficulties. Um, if you all can hold on for just a moment, we'll see if we can get this problem reconciled and get Bob back on. Just one moment. Uh, Bob will be back on in just a minute. We lost connection, but he is getting right back on. All right, so just please hold on. Uh, Let me just say while we're waiting on Bob, we're hoping you're finding the information of value. Uh, One thing that Bob brings with his research, he's also has been in the movement for 60 plus years. And so he has a wealth of personal experience that goes along with his academic kinds of research and whatnot. So I think he was able to share much of that, the personalities that he's been involved with, and some of the events that have transpired as it relates to the movement and it relates to his role and participation on college campuses, particularly Shaw University, et cetera. So we hope you found that information of some value. Again, I have communicated with him, so he is making the effort to get back on. So we'll double check again. Thank you. Okay, my understanding is Bob is back. And we apologize for the technical difficulties. Sometimes, these things do happen. So we will uh, turn the mic back over to Bob. Mhm.